Hi everyone, welcome. I'm over here at my computer and I'm preparing to go visit in on one of my worm bins that needs to be fed today. And before doing so, I thought I would check in quickly on my tracking spreadsheet and give everyone a quick glimpse into some of the stuff that I look at when I'm preparing to feed my worm bins. So the bin that's on the hit list for today is what's currently my oldest worm bin. So that's visible right here in the age of the bin. It's 105 days of age, and over here I've got a little quick cheat sheet that shows that 105 days equates to exactly 15 weeks of age at this point. So in my case, a lot of times a bin reaching its 100 days of age is kind of my rough rule of thumb for transitioning that bin from the composting phase to what I sometimes consider as the foraging phase, which is just a period of time during which I don't really feed the bin very much, and I just give it time so that the worms can really work down what remains in the system as little scraps of unbroken down bits of bedding, food, whatever might still be in there. So rather than giving them fresh stuff, I kind of turn their attention on really working the material in the bin down to a nice consistency, so it's almost purely castings. And it's sometimes during that time I also give the bin a little chance to shed some of its moisture, dry off. So I've been tracking additional bits of information recently, and I kind of broke the tracking of the age into these certain categories of phases, if you want to consider them that. So here is the phase one, if you will, so the so-called composting phase, where, as you can see, this bin is still at the age of 105 in that phase. And we're going to feed today, so we're still composting, but, you know, I keep thinking to myself, when will I start withholding feedings? When will I start into this foraging phase? You know, for a few weeks, depending on how I feel or how the material is coming along. So I try to put in some additional metrics up here, which takes good examples of successful bins and take their values and averages them up here. So you can see if we're presently at the age of 105 days, the average age at which I usually call an end to the composting phase and transition the bin into its foraging phase is 117 days. So, you know, that basically means I'm approaching the point in time where I might want to consider stopping the feeding of the bin and giving the worms a little chance to focus on breaking down the residual leftovers within the system. So the only other thing, I guess, as long as we're on the topic, is the final phase, which is, in my case, most often a migration of the worms straight out of the material. Once the material's been nicely foraged and there's really no reason for them to stay, no more food scraps, no more bedding scraps, setting up a migration area within the bin is often an easy way just to get the worms to exit the material on their own, because they're pretty much in dire need of some fresh food, fresh bedding, so they'll make their way over into that collection area quite voluntarily on their own, and sometimes within a fairly short period of time. So other stuff you see here is just me tracking the number of feedings that get applied to help support the migration of the worms, so on and so forth, and the averaging of the time spent migrating worms. So I just thought I would really quickly show you what's going on with this 105-day-old African nightcrawler worm system that, to my best estimate, has about 2,000 worms in it. It's so far received 11 feedings. Today will be its 12th feeding, and right now I'm considering the switch from composting to foraging soon, but not yet. Today we're going to feed. So let's head on down there now and see how the bin is progressing. So now, one of the statistics that's also shown on the spreadsheet that I showed earlier, which I forgot to make mention of, is the last time that the bin was fed and how many days have passed since that last time the bin was fed. And you might have caught it while we were still looking at the spreadsheet, but in the case of this feeding, it's been 12 days since the bin was last fed. And I did look over the video from the previous feeding. I watched it last night, so it's still kind of fresh in my mind. I do remember there was one bit of leftover that we noticed in the bin when we were in here last time 12 days ago, and it was this right here. It was pretty much a whole avocado. And I guess the other thing we noticed with the avocado last time was the presence of mites crawling around on it. So like, you know, if you look at the food item or whatever the case may be, if you look at the material that's in question of whether or not it's got mites on it, a lot of times if you see a lot of little white specks on it, and even though they're not moving, sometimes there is a chance that they are mites. Because like the white mites, for example, in my bins, they're really slow movers, and usually if we want to try to observe them, then we'll shoot a little bit of time lapse so that we can observe maybe 2 or 3 minutes of their movement within just a couple seconds, you know, significantly speeding up their movement, making it far easier to see. And somehow I just get the sense that maybe we don't have quite as many mites here as we had last time. Maybe that's because it did seem to me like last time there was a greater number of them hanging out on the avocado, but I could be completely wrong. Last time we did kind of break the shell, so it makes me wonder if the mites might have actually moved inside for the more meaty portion of the food rather than staying out on the outer shell, and I think that that's really the case here. Holy cow. I'm not sure 100%. Maybe we will shoot a little time lapse here again like we do sometimes, because I got a feeling all this white stuff that we're seeing here accompanying this little worm hanging out over here, this stuff could very well be mites. You know what? Let's shoot a little bit of time lapse just to see if we can give ourselves a little bit of insight into what it is that we're looking at here. Unfortunately, I won't know right away. I'll only know when I get up onto the computer and start looking at the footage. You know, I think, even though I can't say conclusively if what I'm seeing here are mites, I'm going to make an educated guess and assume that yes, they are, and that there's a lot of them, and maybe even the majority of these worms in here. I don't know about the majority, but this might actually constitute a large number of the mites that occupy this bin. Maybe this is just like one of their favorite things, and maybe I have somehow succeeded in gathering a huge number of mites together. So rather than just leaving this tender piece of yummy food in here for the worms, I think I'm going to replace it, give them something else, and move this little collection of mites out into the outdoor compost barrel. And I think I'll feel better for having done so. And I'm sure that a lot of the stuff we're seeing here is also mites. But hey, why pass up an opportunity to eliminate some of them if it's possible to do so? So let's see. I'm sure a lot of people in the comments probably would have even said, hey, you had a chance to get rid of all those mites, why didn't you? So I think I'm trying to predict what the audience might be thinking and try to go along with the common theme of what people are thinking instead of going against the grain. I don't know, maybe sometimes I just sort of get off into a little bit of a trance state when I'm playing around here in my bins and lose focus on what I'm trying to accomplish. So let's see, I found a couple chunks of corn cob over here as well. I would say that, you know, an avocado with shell obviously is a pretty good size item. Might take a little while to break down. And corn cobs too, for whatever reason, just to look at them as a potential food source might make you think that, hey, that seems like a thing that the worms would probably really enjoy. And I'm sure they do enjoy it. It's just they just can't seem to get at it very quickly. It does take a good amount of time for that stuff, the corn cob, for whatever reason, to break down to the point where the worms can actually start consuming it, or at least various parts of it. I think the middle portion of the cob actually breaks down pretty fast and is available to the worms as a food source pretty quickly, whereas the outer portion of it appears to usually take quite some time to break down. Now, I've got a pretty good size feeding in store for them. That's the other reason I didn't really feel too bad about removing the avocado. I don't think they'll miss it. We do have a good amount of residual bedding here from previous feedings. So you know what, just like the corn cobs, let's stack up some of this stuff off on the side as we bump into it. We could return it all back into the feeding area once we've sort of reconstructed the feeding area with today's portion that they're getting. Before we feed, I just don't want to sort of get a sense of, you know, how is the rest of the feeding area progressing? Can I find any other food scraps or leftovers? Seems unlikely. I'm trying to remember now what kind of foods were applied, because like I said earlier, I did review the video from last time. It'll probably come to me, but offhand it just doesn't really come to mind what I had fed last time. Must have been pretty fast composting stuff though, because I'm not seeing a great deal of leftovers. Other than the leftovers that I kind of anticipated that I would see. Leftovers of the bedding that was used as part of the feeding, all this stuff that's piling up over here, as well as these corn cob bits, which I'm sure I'm missing a whole bunch of. There's probably a good number of them in here. And it's also kind of cool to see that they're doing a really good job breaking down all the bedding I've been supplying lately. I've been really going kind of, I wouldn't say overboard, because I think it's almost spot on as far as the amount that I've been applying lately. I don't know what that is, but that's some sort of a leftover chunk of food. I can't even identify it. It's very unusual. And, you know, these are night crawlers, supposedly African night crawlers, but I couldn't tell you for sure what kind of worms these are. That's what I was told when I got the cocoons originally. But when I compare these worms to other videos that I see online lately, a lot of people have been obtaining African night crawlers and launching them into new worm bins. And man, when those worms arrive from the worm vendor, those worms are huge. I think most of the people I've been watching lately have been obtaining their worms from Northeast Worms. And yeah, that guy, he breeds some big fat African night crawlers, that's for sure. All right, I've made a pretty good sized hole here, but with all these worms squirming around, I can't seem to keep the hole open. They just keep kind of collapsing the hole back down as they move around and squirm around. So I think we've got a good enough hole here to give them the feeding that they're getting today. This is partially a routine thing that you see, which is the coffee, but what's in this bag is also more or less routine. But I guess the one not so routine thing that happened lately was that the freezer that I keep all the worm foods in stopped working for a number of days, resulting in everything in the freezer thawing out. So besides the stuff that was already set aside to be worm food, now there's a whole bunch of additional stuff that's also now, I guess, stuff that you probably wouldn't want to try to eat, considering the who knows how long the freezer was out. But let's progress here with the feeding, because there's not much left to do. We've we verified that there's not a great deal of leftovers. Heck, we even probably eliminated a good number of mites from this population of worms. I'm sure they'll appreciate that. Let's see, how can we start setting this up? I always feel like putting these strips of newspaper in runs the risk of, once they get damp, that they'll all just start matting together. Kind of like what you see here already definitely happening. So I'm definitely not helping it not happen. So I'm not doing anything to avoid it, or at least I've not done so recently. The only thing keeping these sheets of paper separate is the worms that have crawled in between the layers. But my thought was that maybe if I start to blend in sort of a granular matter, so that if a couple sheets of this paper try to mat up to one another, they might not be able to because of the stuff that's sort of in between them. I think that's why a lot of people will wet down their shredded newspaper with COCO core, because that really fine COCO core material will get also, same as the coffee, is the way I'm using the coffee here, kind of in between the sheets of paper, and help prevent matting together of the sheets of paper. So it's all about surface area, as most of you know probably, but if you're new to worm farming, one sort of thing to keep in mind, it's kind of intuitive, so you probably already imagine that that's the case even without being told, but surface area. Basically, if there's a solid chunk of something for the worms to eat, they can only get at what's out on the surface. All the inside of it is unavailable. So as soon as you crack that thing in half, look at what you did. You just pretty much doubled the surface area of that food item, potentially splitting the time that it takes for it to break down in half, right? So there again, that's not official math or the way it really works, I don't think. All right, so I'm just starting to return some of this recycled material that we encountered along the way back down into the feeding area. We haven't even added the bulk of the food yet. Coffee is part of the food they're getting, but you might have been able to see through the plastic bag. They're getting a whole bunch of cantaloupe rinds, which they should really enjoy. So I'm guessing that it's not the kind of feeding that's going to stick around too long. Even though the amount is a pretty good amount, I got a feeling that they're going to do away with it pretty quickly. So let's see, let's bring it in, let's get the food and give it to them. What else do we have here? I guess besides the cantaloupe rinds, I must have also picked out some other stuff. A good portion of what had been in the freezer as human food didn't really get transferred into the collection of worm food. A lot of it just was so gross that it just ended up in the outdoor compost barrel, where there's also worms. They'll be happy. But there were certain stuff, like slightly drier things, like these root vegetables, the shavings of the carrots, certain things I was sort of able to pick out successfully, and not end up just throwing it in the outdoor compost, but actually returning it into little portion bags and putting them back into my freezer. It's kind of like the portion that you saw here today. I created a few little care packages, and they're in my freezer now, refreezing at this point, but yeah, I didn't do all that till today, so as you can imagine, I've been home for a couple days from vacation. Stuff was really starting to stink up the kitchen, and that's probably the reason I finally got down to doing it. Here too, this must have been a full banana. Usually the worm bins only get banana peels, but I did have a couple whole bananas set aside in my freezer collection. Should the day come when I really feel like I need a good tempting piece of food that the worms will usually flock to. That was the one of them. So a couple other ones might have ended up in some of the care packages that I've created, which we'll see in the next few days as I continue feeding my bins to get caught up from having been away on vacation. So I guess this is actually the last of the newspaper supply, but it's a good thing that I've got a bunch of junk mail set aside. Newspapers just like this, these ShopRite supermarket flyers. I don't even know what the other one is, Acme maybe. There's a couple of them. They print their paper on good old traditional, newspaper stock. Don't use any sort of glossy, fancy inks or anything. So I use all that stuff as bedding in my bins. I trust that most of the stuff is basically either straight up wood pulp, or the paint is hopefully kind of a soy-based, the biodegradable material. Now you'll notice one of my favorite toppings when I'm doing bedding like this is leaves, which I didn't put any in this time. And as we start to cover up, you'll see evidence of past applications of leaves, because I've always got a good amount of it on hand. But I always feel like adding leaves in a late stage bin like this one, 105 days old, at this point I definitely won't be adding leaves, because otherwise I'll just end up with a bunch of sticks like this. It's taken weeks and weeks for these sticks to break down to this point. It even makes me wonder about these sticks. This one, and there was another one. These are stems of tomato, I believe. And I gotta admit, they've come quite a way. They look far more broken down than even last week when we saw them in here. Or not even last week. It's been 12 days, right? So almost 2 weeks, actually. And that's kind of nice to see, but I always want to make sure that these large chunk items that I want to see good progress on, I gotta make sure that they're submerged in a place where they get good worm traffic. I've been keeping my bins a little bit drier, so that with that comes, I believe, a little bit of a reduced traffic on the top surface. I'm sure the worms still come up to the surface once in a while, but you certainly don't see as many as if you're running a somewhat more damp bin, or a bin that's covered with plastic, forcing sort of a terrarium effect, recirculation of moisture. We've got little ponds of pools of moisture pooled up. The worms go nuts for that. They'll come right up for that, but I haven't seen that lately since I've been running my bins a little bit more dry. Okay, so once again, I'm just kind of doing what I always do, which is try to poke all the unnatural things like chunks of paper and whatever down into the bed, and then use almost, if possible, all natural looking stuff across the surface, like leaves, just to give it a nice sort of natural look. Totally cosmetic though, there's really no reason to imitate doing it that way. This is just my personal preference. So, I've got a couple more things to do, such as returning or not returning, but moving that avocado out into the outdoor compost barrel where the outside critters can have at it, and there I don't care, the mites can go, you know, enjoy as much of that space as they like. But I know out there they've got predators, so they can't just thrive the way they do in a nice protected worm bin. Once they're out there in my compost barrel, they're fair game for being preyed on by other critters, so I think that helps keep their numbers in balance out there a little bit better than I can do in here. So that's it, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.